The church growth movement. The church has always been interested in evangelism and discipleship, but the church growth movement as a movement is a modern phenomenon. It began with the publication by Donald McGavran of the Bridges of God and of Understanding Church Growth with his son-in-law, C. Peter Wagner. And it continued through the establishment of the Fuller Institute of Church Growth back in the 1980s. McGavran and Wagner sought to use the tools of sociology to better accomplish the Great Commission. It has been a highly controversial movement, but has also been highly effective. The modern megachurch movement, with its seeker-sensitive worship, is a direct result of the church growth movement. And these principles, first set down, have carried many churches on to become very effective. And what we're going to be doing in this lecture is looking at the history of it and some of the principles involved. In later lectures, we're going to be looking at Wagner's 7 principles for church growth and also at some of the criticisms of church growth. This lecture is a brief attempt to give you some history of where the church growth movement came from and some of its basic ideas. The official beginning of the church growth movement was in 1955 with the publication of the book The Bridges of God. Donald McGavran was a missionary to India for many years. In his time in India, he began to notice that the gospel was growing better in some places than in others. McGavran began to ask the issue whether the issue was truly spiritual or sociological. He concluded that it was both. McGavran studied why the missionaries in some provinces of India were more successful than others. His book led to the revolution of thinking, first on the mission field and then in the United States. It was never McGavran's intention to supplant spiritual causes for church growth, only to recognize that cultural and sociological issues played a role in growing churches as well. His principles have enriched the evangelism of the church for the last half of the 20th century and on into the 21st century and on to today. McGavran left the mission field and began teaching at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California, and he became one of the founders of the Fuller Institute for Church Growth. After his retirement, the work was carried on by his son-in-law and protege, Peter Wagner, and for the next 30 years, McGavran and Wagner continued the work of analyzing and writing about the growth of the church. Other writers have been influential in the growth of the movement, people like George Hunter, Win Arn, and John Wimber. The work of the Fuller Institute inspired hundreds of other denominational institutions' expressions of church growth and helped reshape the thinking of denominations of all kinds. Basic factors affecting growth. First, readiness for the gospel. John 4:35 says, "Do you not say 4 months and then the harvest? I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields. They are ripe to the harvest." The basic idea of church growth derives from a key factor in evangelism, being the ripeness for the harvest. McGavran noticed that God's harvest did not ripen all at once, but in many places at once. When the church reached a field where the harvest was ready, the church would grow. In other words, the culture had to be receptive for the harvest and for the gospel. Churches grow where people are most in motion. McGavran noticed that the places where the churches grew best were cultures which were in motion, physically and spiritually. People who were unsettled were more likely to receive the gospel, since everything in their lives was changing already. When the old gods fail, there is room for a new God, the true God, to take its place. Young people are more likely to be converted than old people because young people are more in a state of change. The more change going on in people's lives, the more open and receptive they are to hear something new, such as the gospel. Second, he argued that evangelism is a process. Making disciples of Christ is not a one-time event. It is a process of moving through levels of receptivity to full conversion and discipleship. People are not brought to Christ in a momentary crisis, but as a result of cultivation before and after the event of receiving Christ. The Engel scale is one of the things that's been developed to measure that. One of the most helpful explanations of this had come from Dr. James Engel in his book, What's Gone Wrong with the Harvest. He developed what is known as the Engel scale of receptivity. Here is the diagram. In this diagram, there are 8 stages of resistance before a person comes to a place of repentance and faith. And all of this presupposes that the potential convert has an awareness of a supreme being and is not an atheist or an agnostic. That would require even a longer process. Before we're ready to believe, we must have an openness to the gospel. This requires relationship building, as well as a process of discipleship after the event. Planning for church growth means creating an atmosphere open to the gospel, as well as for discipleship and convention. That means before the church can grow, we must attempt to lower the resistance to the gospel, as well as creating a positive image of the gospel in the minds of potential converts. In church growth, a great deal of interest is given to finding those right groups that do not have a high resistance to the gospel, who do not have entrenched religious prejudice against it. If we can establish a beachhead with key segments of society which are more open to the gospel, that may be able to expand to larger segments of the gospel. The example he gives is India. India has 5 distinctive castes, with the Brahmin leaders at the top and the untouchables on the bottom. The Brahmins are heavily and culturally Hindu. Their way of life has not changed for hundreds of years, so therefore they are least open to the gospel. However, among the untouchables, the most neglected people in society, the resistance to change and the resistance to the gospel is much less evident. Christianity has grown much more among the untouchables than among the Brahmins because the resistance to it has been less. Third, Christianity is a cultural movement. A third insight of church growth is that it is much easier to grow a church within a cultural group than from outside of that cultural group. Resistance is lower when the gospel is heard in a culture of people like themselves. The more people converted in a culture, the easier it is to evangelize. A missionary coming from overseas must earn the right to be heard within a culture. However, if that same missionary takes the time and to learn and respect the language and the customs of the people, if that same missionary trains locals to carry on the work of evangelism, then it will be much easier to be heard. In this diagram, as you can see, a Christian missionary coming in is faced with non-Christians. But when that same Christian missionary begins to create new Christians within that culture using cultural norms, then the resistance to the Christian is much less. When within a culture, many people start to become Christians, the resistance against Christ is much, much less. Church growth has a name for 4 areas of evangelism, 4 kinds of evangelism, you might say. E3 evangelism is the evangelism of foreign cultures, in other words, of missionaries. Those are people who are from a completely different culture, evangelizing people also from a completely different culture. E2 evangelism is evangelism to cultures similar to ours. Those would be like missionaries, be like pastors trying to evangelize people within our own country. We find the resistance to this is much less than if you're dealing with a foreigner. E1 evangelism is evangelism within our own culture. If we're black, it means evangelism of people who are black. If we're white, the same. If for rich or poor, whatever your cultural identity is, it's easier to evangelize people who are within that culture culture. EO evangelism refers to within our own Christian culture. This is the evangelism of our own children, of our own church members who aren't saved, etc. This is growing the church in quality and not just in numbers. A fourth principle is evangelical lift. And this basically says this: the longer we are Christians, the less effective we are at witnessing. Imagine a group of people that are symbolized by the smaller circle who have recently been converted from the larger circle, which are non-Christians believer. The longer they are Christians, the more they move away from that culture, and the harder it is for them to evangelize. So, as we go through our lives, the evangelistic potential of new believers is considerably higher than that of old believers. The longer we are Christians, the harder it is for us to identify with unbelievers, and so our ability to be able to bring people to Christ is considerably lessened. Now, historically, this has been shown in many different ways, but one of the most ways that applications have been shown is by the growth of seeker churches, churches that are designed to attract people who are outside the faith and people who are new believers. One good example of that is Rick Warren's church in Saddleback Church. It's one of the best and the most successful of the seeker churches. And he built his church upon the idea of reaching people who don't go to church. When he started his church, Warren went door to door and asked questions of people, but he only asked them of unchurched people. If you went to a church, he passed you by, and here's the sorts of questions he asked. He asked, what turns you off about church? He wanted to know what people disliked about church. And second, he asked them, if you did go to church, what kind of a church would you go to? And he listened to the answers of those people, but only of the unchurched. And so out of that, he developed what was called the seeker church model. And that went like this. First of all, avoid anything churchy. He found that, at least in his time, that people who worked outside of the church, who lived outside of the church, were turned off by church. So he wanted to avoid anything that looked too much like church. He developed contemporary music and style because he found out that that's what, to identify with the culture that he was in. Informal worship rather than formal worship, because people were turned off by formal worship. To assume nothing. Don't assume that people know the stories of the Bible. You have to tell them. Don't assume that they even know what the Bible is. But start from the basis that they are completely and utterly ignorant of everything biblical or scriptural. And also a visitors come first attitude. Everything in the church was designed to welcome visitors. They were given the first place, and members who've been there for a while were given always the second place. Discipleship was done by cell groups, by bringing people in informal groups of people who basically were like themselves. And finally, he found that there was also a heavy use of multimedia. Since modern people are attracted by videos and are used to speaking through multimedia, to use multimedia to promote the church. The effect of the seeker church has been global. From the Willow Creek Church in Chicago to Elevation in Charlotte, churches that follow the Warren model have dominated the church landscape for the past 20 years. These churches have their critics, and many legitimate criticisms have been laid at them. But no one can deny that they've had a major effect on modern society. In later discussions, we will talk about some of the problems that have arisen from the model of the megachurch and the growth-based churches.